Okay, when the music stops, it's like, get your ass on stage and let's go. Okay, got it. I will follow my cue. Welcome. I think we're gonna leave the door open, let people straggle in here. So this is a strange room, so I'll try to speak to everyone, at least as long as you can see the slides. So most of you, especially if you've been working on OpenStack for a while, so I've been involved in OpenStack for about 5 years now. And one of the things we always hear about is how, game's over. Why are we even still doing this? AWS has won. Let's just, put everything in the public cloud and call it a day. So this is something I talk about with customers all the time around the globe. So I thought I would share some experiences that I've had and mostly just show you a lot of data, since I think all of us are motivated by data. Of what is real and what is not, so that you can feel confident in what is the real situation with OpenStack, with public cloud, with infrastructure holistically, with what customers are doing. And just so I know kind of perspective here, how many of you are with a vendor or working in the community building OpenStack for customers versus how many are end users or in internal IT and delivering OpenStack as, okay, great. So I'll kind of talk to both sides. And the rest of you are just here hanging out because the food was so good? Is that okay? So let's talk through it. So first of all, we do see a lot of data out there that could validate the myths and legends that, it's over, AWS has won, everything's going to the public cloud. Their revenue is obviously very strong, getting into the $5.5 billion just for their AWS revenue. And currently, they are still in first place. It's interesting if you see some really recent data about how Azure is starting to really give them a run for their money. So we're starting to see a little healthier ecosystem in public cloud, which I think is also a great indication. And if you look at overall revenue, and be a little bit careful, because if you look at the categories that this research firm looked at, it even has cloud advertising, right? So there's even like some SEO thrown in there just to screw us up. But obviously billions and billions of dollars in public cloud revenue, no matter which research firm that you look at. And depending on which article you read, and this percentage changes constantly, 100% of workloads are going to go in the public cloud. This is 83% of enterprise workloads will go in the public cloud, 65%, whatever. Everyone loves saying like a huge number of enterprise workloads are just migrating magically into the public cloud, every single second, and everything new is going into the public cloud. And this is perhaps my favorite that I hear from almost every single CIO I talk to, which is, we have a cloud-first strategy. And I was recently in an oil and gas company talking about 200 IT architects, enterprise architects, and I was talking about how so often organizations will immediately say, we have a cloud-first strategy, so we're going to put everything in the public cloud and that's where it's going. And I said, the problem is it doesn't really align to anything strategic underneath that. And literally 200 architects were like giggling in the room because they had that exact strategy. I found out later where they were like, oh, we're cloud-first, right? There's nothing better than hearing 200 people giggle. So if you look at that and much other data that you read every day, I mean, the FUD is all over the place. You could easily say, okay, game over. Let's go home. We lost the Stanley Cup. But the reality is it's not even close. And the important thing is that it is still really early. And it's so easy to forget this because we've been doing this for so long, and but we forget that it wasn't even 10 years ago where we were still trying to figure out what infrastructure as a service versus platform as a service versus business process as a service and all the other asses that we talked about, what they even were, right? And so it's still very, very early. And if you look at this, about 10% of enterprise workloads, I've seen numbers as low as 6%, but typically now it's running around 10 or 15% of total enterprise workloads are in the public cloud. And you can see there's some variance in even what this particular report, this is 451 research, they break out on-premises private cloud versus hosted private cloud. So if you brought some things together around private cloud, you'd have a pretty good percentage that are in private cloud as well as just non-cloud on-premises, which we'll talk more about. Because most workloads realistically are still sitting in on-premises traditional infrastructure and in fact virtualized infrastructure, right? So as much as we think we have gone everything into the public cloud, most of us are still using what we've used for several years, which is virtualized infrastructure. And in fact, we did some research with about 1,000 virtualization, system admins, whatever on the infrastructure side, and they're still expecting to grow their virtualized infrastructure anywhere from 15 to 20% over the next couple of years. Right? So there's still a lot going on in the good old data center where we've run workloads for some time. And the market opportunity for OpenStack, for those of us that are on the vendor side and looking at the community and the growth of the community, right, it is far from over. They're expecting really strong CAGR and a lot of growth. And this is just looking at the direct OpenStack services, right? This isn't talking about the overall ecosystem around this. The storage vendors, the networking vendors. I mean, there's a huge amount of other things that are going on that plug into OpenStack, whether it's from the management layer and everywhere in between, right, and consulting services. So there is a lot of revenue. Is it $400 billion? No, but I think we'd all be happy with $5, $10, $20 billion of a market opportunity. So public cloud is not the enemy. And I think this is an attitude that sometimes you hear among OpenStack advocates that somehow public cloud is we're fighting against public cloud. And the reality is it's not either or. What customers need and what most enterprise IT, and when I say enterprise IT, I include governments and other types of organizations, is hybrid IT. Right? They want the and, not the or. So we're going to talk more about what are we doing to enable that and, whether you're trying to figure out what your strategy is internally or you're trying to help your customers build that. Stop fighting with this or and looking at public cloud as taking away, and more how do we work together to provide that flexibility. This is a study that we did that in talking to enterprise IT leaders around the world, about 60% said their strategy is hybrid cloud. What's interesting is this is a Forrester research study, completely separate, that we weren't involved with, that 60% of enterprise IT leaders said their strategy was hybrid. So what's interesting when you start really digging into the numbers, you start to see a lot of repetition that feels pretty valid, statistically valid. Right? We talked about how many workloads are in the public cloud. 10 to 15% feels pretty good based on looking at 1 million sets of data. Same thing with this. Most people are saying, I want to be hybrid. But this is even more important. That other third don't even have a strategy. They may call it cloud first, but when you really double dip on it and you do research on it, they are not clear on what their cloud strategy is, which means they're using it, but it's still fairly ad hoc, and they're trying to figure out how to make it actually strategic. So there's a lot of work still to be done just to help enterprise IT understand how should I use cloud? What should that look like? And in the meantime, they're using a lot of different clouds. And I think this is going to continue. So even when you talk to organizations that have a clear strategy, they don't want to put all of their apples in one public cloud basket. So they're still going to have traditional on-premises, they're going to have some private cloud, and they're going to have multiple public clouds, depending on maybe it's disaster recovery, maybe it's regional, maybe it's cost, right? And look at the different ways to use that. So Gartner defines infrastructure in these 6 buckets. And so we did some research and asked people within these 6 buckets, how are you thinking about your infrastructure today and in the future? And today, most organizations, which shouldn't surprise any of us here, right, used an average of 2.6 of those. And you can kind of see how many people had one. I would love to know who these people are with one kind of infrastructure. 37%. This was 1,000 organizations worldwide. And they were using private and public cloud, as I mentioned, right? So you can see here, traditional on-premise is about where we talked about, 68%. It's going down, but it's still 50%, in 2 years. Public cloud, about 44%. It's not changing a lot. And as we look at private cloud, it's right there with it. So 43, 41. So if we think about this, that would make sense to me that in the future, we're probably looking at a third private cloud, whether we're managing it or it's hosted or someone else is helping us with that, a third public cloud, and a third still in traditional infrastructure. And it doesn't mean we're not optimizing that traditional infrastructure. It's not like that's standing still, right? We're still trying to modernize it and do new things, optimize our virtualization. Maybe we're moving some things into microservices or different things on the application side. But we're still going to be looking at more traditional data center infrastructure. So organizations are investing heavily in both of these areas. So again, this is an and situation, right? So how do we think about it more in that way? And if we look at overall workload utilization, again, we kind of see those same numbers, right? So overall cloud usage is around 45% of workloads today. And this is research that was done, this is the 451 again. But you'll see I've kind of got data from Gartner and Forrester, and we've done a bunch of primary research, both alone and with partners, as well as 451. And the big thing you hear, and I have heard this term no matter if I'm talking to business leaders, IT leaders, agility is the main goal that they are after. And it may mean different things. I mean, agility is kind of one of those hot button words that can mean different things to different people. But if you kind of dig into that a little bit, it means they want some kind of flexibility and adaptability in a way that is easy for them to do. Right? So how can I be more agile, both from a technology perspective as well as for the business? And so this is what comes up again and again. And this was research that we did with about 1,000 people, cloud technology, a whole bunch of different questions, again, globally. The second one, reduced total cost of ownership. I just saw a study a couple days ago that put that total cost of ownership as the top priority. And so I think you're going to see things flipping depending on who you talk to. Is cost coming up as their biggest pain, or is it agility and innovation? And I think we're still in that same world we've been in for the last 5 years, where if we don't figure out how to reduce cost in what we have today, we're not going to have any investment into innovation. So we're constantly in this battle. So the more we can do to try to loosen up some change in our traditional IT, our existing infrastructure and applications, so we can invest in these new technologies, the faster we'll get through that digital transformation and get to where we want to be from a cloud strategy perspective. And I love this quote. This is from the FSI customer. We look at private cloud as the launching pad for internal applications. And they realized that they just couldn't get the flexibility if they went all in on public cloud, for their needs. And you hear this a lot with FSI because they also have obviously huge compliance and security issues as well. And as I mentioned, private cloud is a key part of digital transformation. It's not separate. So often when we read about digital transformation, it's somehow everything's in the public cloud when we're transformed. And that's not really true. I mean, they're using a variance of technologies in order to transform and be relevant in whatever we're calling this digital era. And private cloud is a key part of that. And why is that? Because they can do a lot of that innovation and not put their data at risk or still have that control they need. So they're constantly looking at that. And we'll talk in a minute about some workloads that OpenStack is really good at. And that's something as a community I think we need to continue to talk about more. It's like, when should I know that OpenStack is the right infrastructure for that application or for that workload? And there are some characteristics that tend to work very well with OpenStack. And then we need to remember to say no to ones that maybe are better in the public cloud. So this is a quote from Forrester that cloud migration is here, but it's not this stampede and mass migration that sometimes what we hear and see would lead us to believe. And I think a perfect proof of that is Gartner has written a whole report about a public cloud exit strategy. So something is not eating your lunch when analysts are writing reports about how to get out of it. And I think this is important because even a couple years ago, this would have surprised a lot of people that we were already talking about exit strategy. And I will tell you, Gartner does not write analyst reports that their customers are not talking about. Right? They're in a business to sell research. So they have this whole thing around what happens if you do find that you're in a public cloud and you want to move it either to another public cloud or back on-prem or whatever you want to do for whatever reasons, what should that look like? And a key part of this research talks about before you even go into the public cloud, be thinking about how you would pull it out. Right? And I like to call public clouds our new mainframes. Right? I mean, at the end of the day, they're a big black box and they're really easy and sticky. And that means if you want to leave it, it gets really hard. Now, that might be fine. Right? But before you put things in there, especially mission critical workloads, think about what if I had to pull this out? What if I had to remove my data, my application, and everything out of that public cloud? So in some research that we did, we asked, if you have moved things back out of the public cloud, what was the reason? And the number one reason was cost was higher than expected. And remember, most people are going into the public cloud initially, yes, for agility, yes, because developers love to use it, but usually because there is a perceived cost benefit in doing so. And then the second thing was performance or availability issues, which a little bit surprised me, because I thought we were over that. And the thing I think about is that, is there some forgiveness of public cloud because of convenience? right? Because it is so easy. And that's something we all need to think about. You know, whether you're internal IT or you're a vendor supporting that, what can we do to make things just so easy that it's no longer, I just have to do this because, you know, my developers just need this stuff right now, or it's just so easy I have no other choice, right? That should be everything that we're doing. And I think that that cost issue sneaks up on people, because if you're putting some data, or you've got an application or something, you know, in the public cloud and it's humming away, and then all of a sudden, you know, you've got a certain level of cost that just all of a sudden takes off and peaks, and people are consuming more and they're not really watching that. And so all of a sudden you get that bill, and it went from being, you know, a quick swipe of the credit card to all of a sudden being a huge expense. So how do we manage that better? Again, it goes back to strategy. So the two most common workloads that were migrated were databases, which would make sense, right? All of a sudden I have way too much data sitting up there and it's really expensive. And the second one kind of surprised me, websites, web apps, because I think a lot of times that's a good place for a public cloud to give. And you'll see in a minute when I look at some workloads that are ideal for these different types of infrastructure, websites tend to be one that works pretty well. Now that may not be true if you have some kind of website that is constantly getting pounded with transactions or something like that, which is a pretty good use for OpenStack, so that might have been the reason. And of course, security. And the session right before this was about security, but you know, we cannot talk enough about this, and it's just getting harder. I mean, if you look at GDPR in Europe, if you look at, you know, just consistent issues and data breaches and hacks that are going on, this is not going away. This is getting harder and harder and harder. And this was some research by Logic Monitor that I thought was really good research. And one of the questions they asked was, what is the biggest challenge for organizations in public cloud? And security came up. Now, to be fair, I think if you just ask them about IT in general, because every piece of research or conversation I have, you could ask this generally, you know, to an IT leader and say, what is your biggest concern in general in life? And security usually comes up. But I think there's still that remaining thing, even though, you know, frankly, if you're doing public cloud in a smart way and security best practices, there's no reason it should be less secure. But I still think there's that feeling that I don't know what I don't know, that black box implication of I don't have complete control. And when it comes to what kind of security they're concerned about, clearly it's data, right? And that's not surprising. And so if data security is your biggest issue and the cost of data becomes the biggest reason to pull out, right, those start becoming the big issues. And I think this was a good example of a customer who's using OpenStack today. And it's a really cool scenario where they are building a cloud platform that enables scientists anywhere in the world to do work together. So it's a real collaborative environment. They can actually do research and scientific study using this cloud platform. And so clearly there was a need for security, because if people are putting their IP and their innovations and ideas and their research, you know, it can't be something that they wanted to be able to get out, but they also wanted it to be really, really simple and very fast and very agile. And so they looked to OpenStack because they wanted to be able to run and control workloads in an environment that was safe, secure, but also run that analysis and have really good research that's done on that. So you can see, okay, I don't know why my clicker just stopped working. That was random. Now well, I'll just sit and watch me as I troubleshoot my clicker. No, okay, we'll just go to old school. Or we won't go to old school either. This is awesome. This is why every time I don't bring my Linux workstation and I bring my Mac, this is what happens. Can you guys advance, or do you know? It's not, it's like it's frozen. I'll just talk the rest of the time. It's so weird. Okay, 1 second. We escaped. We're going to go back in. There we go. All right. And this is why you don't use proprietary technology. This happens to me every time at OpenStack Summit. If I do not use my Linux machine, this is what happens. It's like cruelty. It's like, it never happens to me if I'm on my workstation. Okay, so you can see here they didn't just use OpenStack. They had an ecosystem of solutions around that, and they included unified management and different things. But I think it's a good example. So what I would like to suggest is, instead of always talking about this cloud-first strategy, which, by the way, is not a strategy, that we look at an application-first strategy or a workload-first strategy. For those of us that have been in infrastructure for a long time and love our shiny lights in the data center, it's really easy to start with the infrastructure and go up. And so what I'm suggesting is We instead start with the workload, start with the business goals, start with our line of business partners, and figure out then what would be the best match from a cloud infrastructure perspective. And align those workloads to the right infrastructure. And some of it's going to depend, what are we trying to do with that workload? Are we doing a lift and shift where literally we have a legacy application and we've just got to totally get it off that old infrastructure and move it to something completely new? Are we just modernizing it? So maybe we're containerizing it, turning it into microservices and putting it on a container platform, or are we doing net new development of new applications? And you may develop a different strategy for each of those, which is great. So for your net new, you may decide, you know what, for net new applications, if they don't have data that we're really concerned about, let's let those guys go to public cloud and code away. And then you put policy controls around that, and you have your strategic plans and your processes around that. If you're modernizing existing applications, maybe it's completely different. Maybe you're going to have a different strategy. But each of those you should have clearly set so everyone knows what that is. It's not a guessing game. Every time a developer needs to write a new app or the business wants to do something, are you going to let them go buy a SaaS app, which you have no control of? Maybe. Right? Or are you going to do it a different way? And what's going with this is an increasing trend where more and more organizations are bringing developer resources in-house. Right? Because customized applications are becoming how we compete. So it's ironic that SaaS apps have become so easy, but they don't give us that differentiation and that ability to compete and digitally disrupt our competitors, so we want to build those applications ourselves. So if that's the case, we really better be clear on what is our strategy when we're doing that. So this was just a quote from Gartner that I thought was good because it really aligns with that. Have a strategy that specifies each project workload application and analyze that separately in order to determine the strategies, tactics, potential vendors, and offerings for each effort. And ideally, it's not every single time. I think it works better if you kind of can come up with what are the most common scenarios we're going to face, and then what is going to be our strategy around that. Because otherwise, you're just going to be constantly strategizing, right, which is exhausting. So how do you kind of make those predictable and rinse and repeat? And I think one of the reasons to think about that, and the issues when we start looking at some of the public cloud only strategies, is that applications aren't on an island, right? They are codependent with either data sources or other applications. And that's becoming increasingly true as we try to get smarter about business intelligence and big data, right? Our applications are not just this monolith application that sits alone and that's all we have to deal with. There's a huge number of other forces that are at play with that. So if one piece is over here and another piece is over here and 20 pieces are over here, how are we thinking about that? How are we integrating that? How are we keeping that secure? How are we moving that data? How are we getting intelligence from that? What are the cost implications if we move things around? So if you start looking at those codependencies, it's pretty scary. It's like a bad relationship. You have this codependent relationship going on with all your applications. And I love this quote, right? It's like with one application, there could be up to 12 other apps that you're having to worry about. So as you're doing that strategy and you're thinking about what's right, make sure you're outlining all those dependencies, both technical and non-technical. And we talked before about agility, and this keeps coming up. And I just thought this was really kind of another proof point, which describes your hybrid or multi-cloud strategy. And the number one answer was, I want dynamic movement of workloads to the most appropriate IT environment based on cost, performance, security, data sovereignty, or other requirements. Yeah, that's nirvana. It kind of feels a bit like Narnia, but that's what everyone wants. Wouldn't that be awesome? Oh, I'm just going to move my workload wherever I want, based on cost and security. We're not there yet, to be clear. So this is a vision of what people want. So how can we help them get that? And a lot of this is not a technical issue, right? This is about setting up those strategies and those policies and figuring out how to do that, and then figuring out, okay, what is the technology that will help me do that? And this is just some of the criteria. So when I sit down with our customers, especially CIOs or architects, we try to come up with a list like, okay, let's come up with all the capabilities and criteria that you need to go through for your different workloads so we can start to do this matching game. And so, what's your architecture, scalability requirements? And you'd have a list like this for every application that you could go through. And ideally, it's like an easy bake oven where you put in the requirements, your capabilities, and out comes the answer. Do you guys know what an easy bake oven is? Okay, I all of a sudden had this shocking moment that not only am I female, but I'm old. But it comes out the answer on the other side. You get a baked brownie, or you get, oh, that application should go in the private cloud, or that application can just sit on your virtualized infrastructure. You're good, right? But seriously, that's what we need to get to. So the problem is, the brownie is only as good as the ingredients you put in it. So how you set up that criteria and those capabilities and the evaluation you make of those is going to make the difference of whether you've got a plan that will actually work. So let's look at workloads. So we did a bunch of research, and these colors look overwhelming, so I'm just going to cut to the chase on here. But when it came to private cloud, the most common workloads that people felt they were successful in deployed on private cloud were databases and business intelligence apps, which makes sense if you think about everything we were talking about. And the reality is, this was a research of OpenStack users. So these were specifically companies already using OpenStack. What workloads do they deploy on that? And you can see here that it's very similar. Databases ranked very high. NFV obviously is a huge workload. Software as a service delivery, which actually somewhat surprised me. Storage, backup, archiving, big data analytics. So you're starting to see some repetitive information about where people are finding the greatest use for OpenStack. And I will tell you, just from my experience and the customers that I've spoken to, anything that is going to be leveraging a huge amount of data and a lot of transactional power is where OpenStack really shines, right? Because then you can really take advantage of the scalability that OpenStack gives you. So, for example, we have one customer in the UK that runs a betting platform. So if you think about what's happening with that is people are doing betting transactions constantly every second, that's where OpenStack shines. So if you have a really simple application, you may not need the robustness and power of OpenStack. Right? Maybe that is traditional infrastructure. Virtualization may be fine. Public cloud may be fine. Right? But if you have something that really makes OpenStack shine, that's when you see the value. And then when it comes to public cloud, this makes sense. Websites, web apps, mobile apps, app servers, collaboration apps do the best on public cloud. And some of this means this is where they're getting the ROI. That's where they're seeing this value in using that infrastructure with that workload. And I thought this was an interesting point that when people are moving their applications to public cloud or choosing a SaaS application instead of an on-premise traditional app, they do it a lot at one time. And I thought this was interesting because this kind of goes against what I've seen where people are being a little more selective. And so the question is, good or bad? Remember, it's early days. So is this just oh my God, I've got to cut so much cost, I'm just going to throw 100 apps in the public cloud? I don't know, but I just wanted to share this because it kind of goes against some of my logic and what I'm seeing, but it's true that people are doing this. So when they are finally moving stuff, they're doing it in large quantities of applications. All right, so what do we need to do? One of the things, we talked about ease of use, right? Public cloud-like capabilities. So we, and I'm going to use the universal we, whether you are building OpenStack, you're doing a distribution, working in the community, or in internal IT, we have to make this easy to support, implement, and update. And you've seen a lot of advancements in the community around this. This has been a huge focus the last couple of years, as we, I guess I could say, compete or partner with other infrastructure, right? So you can see here, documentation. So even documentation, we so underestimate the need for that. And again, if you're sitting in internal IT and you're working with people around the world, how you document your processes, your technologies is always like the last thing we think about. It's almost like your manuals at home, right? Like, where did I put that manual? I don't know. Like, does anyone know how that process is documented? So in the community, I would challenge us to think more and more about how we simplify it to make it more consumable. Simplified installation, upgrades, and update processes, right? That's really crucial, especially when we've got an innovation cycle like we do in most open source communities. How do we make that simple for people to consume so they still get that innovation, but it's not creating chaos in their environment? And then ability to move workloads to different providers and platforms. So, we talk about lock-in, and I hear two different things about it. I either hear customers don't care at all about lock-in, or it becomes a top priority that I'm really concerned about lock-in. It's one of those things I'm not sure what the truth is, but regardless, I think where it comes down to being true is when they say, I want the flexibility to move something when I want to move it. So that means I don't want to be locked into something because then I can't move. So how do we help with that transition? And make sure we're constantly talking about benefits. We cannot talk about business value enough, especially when the lines of business have so much control over what we're spending with IT, right? So functional lines are doing more and more and have budget control or at least influence. And so how can we show the ROI, whether it be technical benefits or ideally business value benefits? And this was one in that Forrester report. What were the key reasons driving you towards going to the cloud? Ability to scale quickly and easily. We just talked about that, right? Significant cost reduction shows up, and there's other ones in here. Benefits of managed services. So some of this goes to your core competencies. If you are running an IT operation and you are looking at OpenStack and you're looking at other technologies, what are your core competencies that you have in-house? Can you train your people to use OpenStack, but you want the benefits and you don't have the ability to train them? Then do you look at a hosted, a managed service, right? You don't have to consume it all yourselves. So there's different ways we can look at that. And in order to achieve clear benefits in ROI, so here's an example where faster delivery of new IT services. And this is the #1 reason people even went to the public cloud in the first place, right? Because they couldn't wait 6 weeks for a VM to be spun up. So it goes back to, if we don't give them what they need, whether that they as developers or the line of business, our stakeholders, even our end users, external customers, they're going to go somewhere else. So it doesn't matter which technology we're using, we've got to provide that now on-demand experience. And some of the benefits people expect from going to cloud, be it private or public, better IT cost management. And what's interesting is, this is an area of huge growth, again, around that OpenStack and public cloud ecosystem where we have, I don't know how many companies now that are doing specifically cost management. Why? Because this is really hard to do. We don't want to be surprised. So here's some examples of some clear ROIs. And as you're going into these projects, if you haven't done OpenStack and you're doing a POC, think about these ROIs as you're going into it. Partner with your vendor to figure out, what can I do to show the value of this when you're going in, so you're not surprised. Set up your key results that you want. So this was about a 50% return on investment, which is pretty good. This one for FICO, most of you probably know this brand. Big OpenStack user. They also use a ton of public cloud, so very much a hybrid cloud strategy. They reduce build times from days to minutes, and they're continuing to try to cut that away, and lowered overall cost by 30% and storage costs by 60%. Right, so these are really big numbers, and it means that everything that they're doing, they're able to move to more innovation. And then, of course, security benefits, right? Constantly be able to show them, what am I doing to maintain security? The other big thing is interoperability. And this goes somewhat to that agility, but it's also overall, is people just need stuff to work together. I am constantly amazed that when you talk about challenges in overall IT, integration continues to come up in the top 3. And yet somehow we think we solved that a long time ago. I was in the integration space 10 years ago, and so every time I hear that, I'm like, oh my God, we've not fixed this. In fact, it's gotten worse, as you can imagine, because now our shit's all over the place, right? So how do we integrate that and bring it together and make sense of it? It's really, really hard. So how do they think about that? So the options were, okay, we don't have multiple clouds, so don't worry about interoperability. Little to no interoperability between cloud environments, some interoperability or seamless interoperability. Again, let's talk about nirvana. What do I really need? And if you look at today and in 2 years, where are the biggest jumps? Where you would imagine, right? The biggest jump is in seamless interoperability. They want the clouds to just work together. And there's a lot of hype in the market about hybrid cloud versus multi-cloud. And the way I think about this is, at the end it doesn't matter really, but multi-cloud is just a bunch of clouds, right? It means you're using multiple clouds. Hybrid cloud, or the promise of hybrid cloud, is you're using multiple clouds, but they're actually working together. They're somehow, tied together, integration, they're working together, or maybe they're sharing a common data set. Whatever it is, that's the promise of hybrid. Right? So we can use multiple clouds, but at the end of the day, if they're not helping us work together and giving us some level of intelligence, what's the point? We're just throwing stuff on infrastructure. And of course, organizations need containers and OpenStack to work hand in hand. And I just saw a stat as I was coming up the escalator that said, OpenStack users are 3 times more likely to use containers. So I would agree. I don't know, it sounds like, physician recommended. But many of them have already deployed it, right? So 23% of OpenStack users today have already deployed containers. And increasingly, that's Kubernetes, right? So, I mean, one of the reasons that we've seen so much movement in the industry around these kind of consistent ways of addressing this, like if you look at your overall architecture, you want things that are done consistently across these different types of clouds. So if Kubernetes becomes that common orchestration that you can use, whether it's public cloud, private cloud, or traditional infrastructure, now we're starting to get some of that seamless interoperability. Maybe KVM is your virtualization layer that can take you from traditional all the way to public cloud, or Ansible as your automation layer. So start thinking about those things. You can help when you think about architecturally, what could you do consistently as those architectural fabrics, so to speak, that also helps with that interoperability. And this is what I was just talking about. So if you think about it as containers that can take you across that. The other thing is we've really got to provide a lot more skill set. If you talk to network admins and virtualization managers and these guys that are sitting in the data center, they're watching the developers be the cool kids. If you just look at OpenStack, written in Python, pretty cool, can we bring them to the future with us, right? They need to have new skill sets. They want to be part of this digital transformation, and sometimes it's really hard. So what can we do to bring them into that, give them new skill sets, do training? Right, especially if we're moving more and more in-house, especially if you're going to have more security and compliance regulations. We need to bring our IT staff to the future with us. So just kind of going through the summary here. So clearly, we're moving things in the cloud. I don't think anybody is questioning that. But it's important to note that it really is becoming a balanced investment, and increasingly, organizations are investing as heavy in private cloud as public cloud, if not more, as well as other on-premises capabilities. Security and staffing challenges, are going to continue to be our biggest priority and challenge. It's really about hybrid, and OpenStack is a critical part of that. So I think the biggest takeaway too is the more we can do, as we talked about earlier, to really think about application in and how OpenStack can empower those workloads to have that seamless interoperability, to move things around, and importantly, bring the business the intelligence that we need to compete better. That's really when we're going to win. So with that, I think we just have a few minutes for questions if anyone has one. Because we're an excellent audience. Yes, sir. Oh, God. Yes, Lou Tucker.
A couple years ago, there was a whole movement. Everything was going to become SaaS.
Yep.
Because not only did people not want to manage their infrastructure, they didn't want to manage the applications.
Right.
So
great question. So you're saying a few years ago, everything was moving to SaaS. Have we seen that change? I'll answer that yes and no. So as I mentioned, from a pure SaaS application, like I'm just going to go get a SaaS application off the shelf so I don't have to build it, I'm actually seeing a trend that is looking to people doing more customized applications. On the other hand, though, I think what we are seeing is everything delivered as a service is absolutely continuing, including infrastructure. I mean, the one thing I will tell you is that at Red Hat, we're looking at how do you create everything as a service? So there's almost an abstraction layer. So regardless of whether it's OpenStack or Linux or virtualization, I just need some compute and some networking and whatever I need, and it's delivered as a service. So creating more abstraction and delivering things as a service, whether it's to your ultimate end user or your internal stakeholders, that definitely is happening. It's just not so much off the shelf anymore. I don't know. Is that what you're seeing? Yeah. Other questions? Yes, sir.
One of your earlier slides, you said 43% of customers are using existing virtual technology. What is that virtual technology?
So a huge amount of it is vSphere, right, of course, but it's multiple hypervisors. I mean, I didn't have it in this, but what I will say is organizations are actually using multiple Hyper-Vs now. So it's Microsoft, it's VMware, it's Red Hat virtualization, it's Oracle, it's whatever. And I think the question is, going back to the earlier discussion, is that was probably for the same reason as we're not just using one public cloud. Like, how do we kind of maintain cost? How do we not get locked into one vendor? How do we have better negotiation capabilities with our vendors? But the question is, if you think about that virtualization layer, what do I need to do to have consistency? And at the end of the day, I mean, speaking as a vendor, I never expect that we're going to have every single layer of the infrastructure all the way up to management, all red, so to speak. So if VMware is your virtualization layer, great, let's work with that and let's work around it. And that's what vendors need to do, right? That no one's going to have every single layer of the stack. So how do we make sure we have an open API infrastructure? How do we make sure that we're sharing information? And that's where, of course, obviously, more of an open environment is beneficial. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Startups, especially small startups, it seems that public cloud makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so that's a great question. He's asked about startups and public cloud. So, I mean, obviously, if you are, building a new application and you're a startup, using the public cloud is the absolute easiest thing you can do, right? Because you're not going to build out your own infrastructure. That would not be a good use of your investment unless, you got $200 million or something. But I think where it becomes the question is, what is that application and how are people going to be using it? And is there a point where putting everything in the public cloud is now going to become more of a cost hindrance to you? But if I was starting a startup tomorrow, I would absolutely leverage public cloud. Absolutely. Other questions? All right, and I'm getting the time is up. Thank you very much. You've been a great audience. Have a great day.